here we're at a turning point in the course. That picture I showed you at the beginning of the course of the triumph of the New York School, of the artists dressed up like their military generals signing over the treaty rights to the other, from European powers to the American powers. And I'll show that picture to you again in just a second. But that picture captures a lot of the things that we're going to talk about, the changes in the period that we're looking at. And the first one is from European to American power. I mentioned this briefly, that T.S. Eliot really wanted to be, he became a British citizen. He really wanted to be a European. He lived in Britain. His style of writing and his art was influenced more by Europe than by America, probably. And what's going to happen and that was true of many American artists. Hemingway, Gertrude Stein, all the important American artists and writers, almost all of them, went to Europe at this time of modernity. Okay? And so they were influenced by modernism. Okay? And that's what we learned about last time. What we're going to learn about this time is we're not quite learning about postmodernism, or what comes after modernism, what continues modernism but comes after it and changes it. We're going to be talking about this period in between that's kind of late modernism or early postmodernism. You could call it either one. Okay? But it's a new artistic style, and we'll talk just in a minute about how we're gonna talk about that. But we'll use the term congeniality. It's a more congenial kind of art. T.S. Eliot's art was not very congenial. It was not friendly. It was not pleasurable to read. In this period, art becomes more associated with popular culture as well as high culture. It starts to shift to be more in tune with popular culture, and that's one of the main things that makes it a little bit more friendly, a little bit easier to read. Okay? You'll notice in the two reading assignments we had for today, the Bob Kaufman poems are a little more modernist in style. He was more heavily influenced by modernism. Lawrence Ferlinghetti is writing in a much more popular American style, and so he's more emblematic of that shift. Okay? And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. So again, the shift from modernity, the world of modernity was a world of machines and new inventions. Okay? The world of the late modern, postmodern period is going to be a world of mass products. Okay? In the modern period, your car was built by a machine, or by people on an assembly line, but your broccoli was still real broccoli. It wasn't agribusiness, mass genetic modifications, huge machinery out on the farms. Farming was still largely local and non-industrialized. What happens then in this later period is that modernity sort of swallows up everything. Okay, now your food is produced by modernity, your butter is margarine, you eat Campbell's soup from cans, everything in the house, in your house is, modified and industrialized increasingly. Now, In today's world, we started to move away from that, and people are shopping at co-ops and buying local organic foods. There's a way in which the world is changing in a new way. But in the 1950s, everybody wanted Campbell's soup. They wanted mass produce. They wanted Twinkies and Hostess products. Okay? So that was one thing that had a huge impact on people. Okay? And then we're going to talk in just a moment about some of the historical events and some of the cultural events that kind of mark the shift from one stage to the next stage. Okay? So if we talk about history, we're talking about the period from basically 1950 to 1970, give or take a few years. Okay? And the events that mark the beginning of this new period are first and foremost World War II and the end of World War II. Okay? Because it was the dropping of the atomic bomb. The atom bomb's another thing. If you thought that planes and machine guns and things like that changed the world, the atom bomb was a real message of just how powerful the instruments of modernity were, the technologies and the machineries. And in the same way that mass products invaded your household and took over your world, the fear of nuclear annihilation, and the Cold War, which is just the ongoing after effects of the atom bomb, really mark a new period in world history. Because now it's not the tension between European powers that caused World War I and World War II, but it's the tension between the United States and the Soviet Union that becomes the dominant geopolitical divide. So if we take our picture of the European and American armies after the end of World War II, the key political players are the First World and the Second World, or the Soviet socialist world. Okay? What are some of the other events that maybe mark? Oh, and the other thing was the end of World War II meant the end of world wars. There were still wars, but there hasn't been a global war on the same scale that the world wars were in the last half century. Okay? What are some other events that might show us the beginning of a new moment in history? Yeah. Yeah. The formation of the UN, right? That's the first real, I mean, there were earlier attempts to create a global government, but it was a sign that the world was becoming more globalized rather than defined in terms of just national boundaries, right? That's an important one. Can you think of two or three others?
The 60s.
Okay, and the 60s jump ahead a little bit, because what I'm going to say is the 1950s and the 1960s. Okay? These are the two decades. You have all the rebellions and the student peace protest movements of the 1960s, but in the 1950s, you had a decade of kind of what we call square America, of conservatism, non-rebellion. The students weren't active, they were passive. And it was kind of, you kind of have these two decades as the two sides of the changing culture of the of this period in American history. And really, it kind of goes like this, that, let's see how to define it. You know, in the 50s, there was an undercurrent that developed into the 60s, and still in the 60s there was an undercurrent of conservatism in America, but they kind of crossed borders right in the early 60s. Okay? What's another event that marks the beginning of really the age of American power, right? The atom bomb.
The space race.
The space race, right? And that's, in a sense, just part of the Cold War. But think about the difference again. When we talked about modernity, we talked about flying. When we talk about the beginnings of post-modernity, we're talking about going to the moon. That's a whole, sure, humanity dreamed that maybe one day that would be possible, but that was something that people, had even less belief in than being able to fly, period, right? That was a huge marker of just how profoundly modernity had shaped the world. Now it seems like we literally could do just about anything. Hey, let's think of one more event that marks the transition to what we kind of call the American century now, but this period of American power. Yeah.
The civil rights.
Okay. The civil rights movement's a great one. It sort of parallels what we talked about with the 1960s. It begins in earnest in the 1950s, and it grows and grows until the late 1960s. And one of the things that we could talk about now is we're starting to talk a little bit more about things going on within the United States as being central defining markers for the world as a whole. That the world looked to America and what was going on in America as sort of a model in the way that it used to be that modernity was defined in terms of European events largely. Okay? So, when we talk about late modernité, or the social implications, the cultural, political implications of this change, we're going to talk in terms of the squares and the beats. Or really the spirit of the 1950s and the 1960s. Though the beats were kind of the rebels that as early as the 1950s were sensing the change of times, sensing new race relationships, sensing all the changes going on in America. So they started as early as the 50s, but they had the spirit of the 1960s. Whereas Square America was a period where people were largely acquiescent, quiet, conformist. What are some of the images you have of the 1950s in your mind? What? Yeah, refrigerators, and I guess they didn't have microwaves back then, but dishwashers, appliances, right? The products, the mass products of America, that was the age in which Campbell's soup came to dominate America, and so did the refrigerator and that car and the suburbia, the suburban tract home. What are other images? Yeah, right. And so not just suburbia, but the suburban houses that all look the same, right?
The ideal family, the wife at home, 2 kids.
Right. Ideal family, which came along with it, rigid gender roles and sexism and the oppression of women. But it was the ideal family, and many of us, not many of us, but some of us long to go back to, the good old days when everything was in its box and place. Okay. You think of one more image.
Really corny but effective advertisement.
Okay, and Mad Men, if you've watched that show, you know what the difference was about advertising in the 1950s? Is they tried to get you to buy something, right? They told you, buy our product, whatever. Now advertising, all it is like dudes on skateboards, in tie-dye t-shirts, whatever it is they're selling. You have no idea, are they selling Viagra? Are they selling beer? Are they selling cars? They just put lots of images up that are cool and expect you to buy this stuff. But it's not like buy this because it does A, B, C the way it was in the 1950s. Okay? But you can think about the crew cut haircuts and the poodle skirts and everybody sort of dressing the same, cruising around in their hot rod cars. This was that sort of era of American culture. Okay? So what I want to talk about now is the cultural form of what we'll call late modernism. How did culture change in response to this new geopolitical situation, but also this new period in American history, both internationally and nationally, we're going to look at. And the term I'm going to use is congeniality. Okay? And I'm taking it from another man's work. W.T. Lamone is his name. He wrote a book called Deliberate Speed, and most of this lecture is taken from that. But that book. But what his idea was, well, I'll explain it as we go along. But his basic idea was that modernism had run its course. People had done all these crazy experiments, and they were interesting and fascinating. But at the end of the day, nobody cared. When people looked it up, they, maybe people in libraries and university professors cared. But average Joes, when they looked at Picasso's painting, a lot of them said, well, I don't see anything I can relate to here. When they read James Joyce, they said, I'm confused and this doesn't make any sense. So people wanted to turn back towards what might be a more friendly style, and this happened to sort of correspond with the fact that now American popular culture was sort of taking over the world. It, rather than European culture, became the sort of central reference point. Okay. So think about all the references in T.S. Eliot's poem. There's hundreds of them. And there's one maybe to American jazz music. Very few are to American popular culture. They're towards European culture and mostly elite university culture. What happens with the shift towards American culture is that popular culture becomes more central at the same time that American culture becomes more central to global culture as a whole. And this can be a good or a bad thing, but it's definitely one of the main shifts that goes on in culture. So this picture here of the Europeans ceding power to the Americans really illustrates the shift in not just political power, but also cultural power. Okay? One of the best examples of this is the artist Andy Warhol, who's most famous for his Campbell's Soup paintings. And you may have always wondered, you probably wondered, why did Picasso paint the fragmented cubist things that he did? But you probably also wonder, why did Andy Warhol start painting Campbell's soup cans? It doesn't make any more sense. But what this lecture is going to do is try to explain a little bit to you what's going on there. Okay. So this is a song by the Velvet Underground, which was a rock group that Andy Warhol really kind of financed and took under his wing and fostered their development. You can't imagine T.S. Eliot having a house band, along with what his work was doing. His work was everything in the antithesis towards the development of American pop culture and rock music.
Don't know.
But there's maybe no two better images of American pop culture than the mass products of soup and the cultural product of rock and roll music. Those were two of the dominant sort of influences in post-World War II America. And here's just a quick...
He was the most American of artists, and the most artistic of Americans. So American, in fact, that he is virtually invisible to us. We look at him, and know little of ourselves, learn little of Warhol, because he was us, in all our innocence, ambition, and insecurity. A hard-working Democrat, a churchgoer and businessman, a social climber, empire builder, and inveterate consumer. In Warhol, the simplicity of a typical American citizen and the simplicity of artistic genius are so intermingled that we cannot distinguish them, nor properly credit either his Americanness or his genius. Dave Hickey.
I think he's a touchstone of the culture, and I mean more than painting, art history. I think he's a touchstone of the culture we live in, a touchstone for the entire culture of the post-war period. I think he is probably the most important artist of the second half of the 20th century, maybe the most important artist of the 20th century.
So what Picasso was to the first half of the 20th century, Andy Warhol was to the second half of the 20th century. And here's the beginning of a definition of collegiality. W.T. Lamone says, in the mid-50s in America, the clogged arteries of official modern culture finally popped open. Okay? So this culture that had been modernist and been becoming more and more and more modernist until it really had nothing left to say to people, it finally exploded open and a new culture emerged out of it. The release occurred when it became obvious how the prestigious wing of every art had cut itself off from its potential public to follow its own heedless autonomy. So the art became all about itself and not about connecting to the people. And he gives the example of skyscrapers on 6th Avenue in New York City as one example of this. And we'll look at what he's talking about. Okay? This is the type of skyscraper that was being built after World War II in America. And it had turned away from all the traditions of architecture, the beloved buildings like the Empire State Building and the Rockefeller Center, to become just this box of glass and steel. And I'm going to show you a little bit how this change occurred and why maybe people weren't excited by it. So you used to have traditional European-style buildings in New York City, all the famous buildings like Grand Central Station or the New York Hippodrome. And then the New York skyscrapers came along and tried to make things taller and taller. So something like the Woolworth Building, it looks like a Gothic cathedral, but it's just been stretched up 20 stories too tall. Or here, the Plaza Hotel looks like a Victorian house that again has been stretched 20 stories. So people were starting to build bigger and bigger skyscrapers. And the traditional skyscraper had setbacks like this. And the reason for this was so that the light could get down to the street. If you built up all the way to the street wall, you would have no light anywhere. So they made it that New York skyscrapers, the higher up they built, the more they had to set back away from the street. And then the third element was ornamentation, that on the top of all the skyscrapers, this must be Chrysler Building and Empire State Building, there was the kind of ornaments that you would have found in European buildings. But what happened after World War II was the traditional brick building structures got replaced by just grids of glass and steel where everything looked like a graph paper. You know, it was just kind of a homogeneous geometrical grid rather than the traditional building styles. These are the same building that in 1954 they took that older style building and they just put a glass and steel facade on it to make it look more modern. And then glass and steel boxes replaced the setbacks. So the setbacks of traditional buildings that New Yorkers had gotten used to were now just replaced by a pure box structure. So you can see how there's all these different kinds of spaces and architectural structures in New York City, and they're starting to be replaced by just these simple black boxes. Or sometimes you would get rows after row of them. People call this the X, Y, and Z building because it's three, completely anonymous-looking, identical skyscrapers in a row, basically.
Moloch skyscrapers stand in the long streets like endless Jehovah's.
That's going to be a line from Allen Ginsberg's Howl that we'll talk about later. But I want you to remember this image when we get to Howl of how the city was being replaced by these corporate skyscrapers that were just long boxes.
What sphinx of cement and aluminum bashed open their skulls and ate up their brains and imagination?
And he's talking about the city losing its imagination and creativity as people just mass-produce skyscrapers the way they mass-produce Campbell soup cans, all looking just the same. Then you had housing projects, which just threw up, cement boxes, big boxes instead of little boxes. And you had the suburbs that threw up the homogeneous-looking little boxes, right? And so all of the spaces of New York City, from the skyscrapers to the housing projects to the suburbs, were all becoming more mass-produced and losing their sort of traditional identity and character. This is the best example I can show you. Look at all the different kinds of spaces in New York City. And here somebody took, 2 square miles or whatever, and just put in row after row of identical looking buildings. Literally the architectural equivalent of Campbell's soup cans. So, what Limon is trying to tell us is that this area here, who likes that, right? Who falls in love with those buildings and says, oh, I wish all the buildings in New York looked exactly identical? The modernist architects had reasons for building this way, and this was their style. Remember back to the Bauhaus that we looked at the beginning of the course, the desire to get rid of traditional ornamentation and build more geometrical structures. I mean, that was okay when you had just the Bauhaus, but now you're getting it sort of run amok, where the whole city is kind of being taken over by identical-looking buildings. So the same thing, the Cubism of Picasso, that we've already seen, Deschamps, gets even more and more, chaotic and splattered and fragmented in the work of Jackson Pollock, one of his works. Or color painters. This is Mark Rothko, and these are actually beautiful paintings, but your average person is sort of looking at them and going, one guy's just painting, throwing paint at the canvas, and the other guy's just painting a red and an orange square. And average people were starting to lose interest in art and architecture and poetry and many other fields. This is maybe the extreme, a white painting of just a white painting on a white wall. That's sort of taking modernist experimentation with art to its extreme form. And your average person is going to look at that and say, I don't really see, it doesn't really speak to me. I don't see what you're doing here. It was all about the artist and not about the viewers. Let's see. This is John Cage's 4 minutes and 33 seconds. It's a sort of amazing performance. If you want an example of art that's lost touch with but it's an art that's lost touch with the audience. It's all experimental and interesting to the artist's conception of art, but it doesn't say much to people.
Where the performer does absolutely nothing, allowing the audience to absorb the sounds around them. Everyone experiencing the piece in a different way, therefore, because we all hear things in a different way. Tonight the piece has been presented in a full orchestral version, conducted by Lawrence.
4 minutes of silence in full orchestral
each of the three movements. He'll turn pages when he needs to, and of course the orchestra will remain silent, we hope, throughout the piece. I reckon Cage would have been pretty pleased that this piece is being televised, because of course you at home are going to experience this piece in a very different way to those of us here in the hall. Well, I promise you, this is the piece everyone here tonight has come to experience. There really is nothing like John Cage's 4 minutes, 33 seconds.
Alright, the rest of it's pretty much the same. So, watch the whole thing. But, you know, you start off with T.S. Eliot or James Joyce experimenting with words, and pretty soon you got people experimenting so much that they're just creating silence, right? And it's an interesting idea, but not that many people are going to really buy tickets, except sort of the elite experimental type. I mean, I don't think I would pay to go see it, since you can enact it at your own home for, you know, much less than the ticket price. So what he says here is that issue is congeniality. As a cultural strain matures, it may go awry. Rather than heeding wider social needs or public interests, a culture strain may develop autonomous values that look into its own traditions, rather than heeding the human needs. And at the very end, he says, some of these cultural practices essentially march the medium off over a far cliff, as happened in modern poetry and music. Okay, that people just got too experimental, and they lost track of what maybe art should be about the people that the audience that listens to it. So what happened was, after World War II, artists started the upstart strategy of breaking out of appointed and anointed spaces, out of the sealed-off museum, towards a more interactive kind of art that would involve the public more. So here you can see, this comes a little later in the 1980s in architecture, but now people are creating interesting spaces that people are interested in, rather than just the black box skyscraper. Now you get this more fun, playful style that's more interesting for actual people. This is the Frank Gehry Disney Hall, and we've talked about Frank Gehry before. But another example of him trying to make architecture more interesting. This was his Guggenheim Museum, and if you've ever seen Frank Lloyd Wright's Modernist Guggenheim Museum, it's just a round circle that kind of gets wider as it goes up. But it's very abstract and geometrical, whereas this is more complex and a little bit more interesting to the average viewer. So here I'm going to read a little of you from Frank O'Hara's Oranges poem. This is when he was still a modernist and heavily influenced by modernist painters. Voyagers, here is the map of our dear dead king left us. Here the rosary he last spat upon. Here his score of seraglio. Here his empty purse. Let us pray and meditate always on deep things. Rhinestones and chancres, twins of our bosoms, Christian constellations, resplendent pins, fly on, dredge for the gold dust in the snow, the blood beneath the ice, a mad mud junket. Okay? you can see how that sounds like T.S. Eliot or even like James Joyce, and it's just random play of words, but it doesn't really connect to the audience. You can't really find anything going on in it. But this is his poetry just a couple years later.
In New York City, I search for the beautiful disease.
It's my lunch hour, so I go for a walk among the hum-colored cabs.
Search for beautiful.
First down the sidewalk where laborers feed their dirty, glistering torso sandwiches and Coca-Cola with yellow helmets on. They protect them from falling bricks, I guess. Then onto the avenue where skirts are flipping, you know, like in the Marilyn Monroe movie, above hills and blow up over grates. The sun is hot, but the cabs stir up the air. I look at bargains and wristwatches. There are cats playing in sawdust. On to Times Square where the sign blows smoke over my head, and higher the waterfall pours mightily. A Negro stands in a doorway with a toothpick languorously agitating. A blonde chorus girl clicks. He smiles and rubs his chin. Whoops. I stop for a cheeseburger at Juliet's Corner. Okay? So I can't imagine a wider shift in styles from that European confusing style to this. They call this his I do this, I did that poetry. He's just walking around on his lunch break writing about what he did. And he's writing a poem about eating a cheeseburger at Juliet's Corner, right? This is like the Andy Warhol soup cans, this turn towards American popular culture as the center of culture rather than European culture. Here's another guy, Robin Rauschenberg. He looks like a modernist there, but now he's got a hockey puck, a hockey stick in his painting. He's putting stop signs and street signs and buildings. It's still modernist and fragmented, but now you can understand it more. You can see some of the images. You can kind of relate to it a little bit better. People started painting targets and maps of the United States and American flags. A lot of it was about America, and a lot of it was very obvious imagery rather than the complex hidden truths of modernism. Here's Klaes Oldenburg. He's got a cherry on a spoon. He's got a baseball bat and clothespin sculptures. So this congenial culture turned towards ordinary objects and pop culture artifacts. The art stemmed directly and explicitly from the works and the attitudes of Rauschenberg and Jones, kind of beginnings of pop art. So you can see how artists move from the fragmentation of modernism to the extreme formalism, just paint on canvas, colors, or the Jackson Pollock splatter paintings, and then they moved from that to the mass popular culture images, the more congenial images of an Andy Warhol. So Andy Warhol had parties like a rock star in his museum space. He had the rock band, the Velvet Underground, that were sort of part of his act. You know, they worked together. He was famous at a disco called Studio 54, but he's a part of the disco rock and roll underground rather than being some elite, fancy, cultured artist. The subject matter of his painting turns almost exclusively to American pop culture. Marilyn Monroe, Elvis, more Monroes. And he did a lot of repetitions. This was when mass culture was producing things like television and reruns and Campbell's soup cans that all looked alike. He would just give you a series of Elvises, or his Campbell's soup can multiplied more, He's trying to get at the kind of mass production and repetition of Coke bottles. We just got 2 more images. Last one, the tomato soup can. Why did this change happen? Think about that. What does it mean? And is this even art? I mean, we thought that modernism wasn't necessarily art. How do we make sense of and interpret this kind of art? And what's the value of this kind of art? So we'll pick up there next time. What is this new kind of art that's being created? Okay. Okay. What's your name?
Will, Charlie.
Let me just turn this one off.
Do you have office hours by chance?
I do have office hours if you want to talk. Do you now? Does now work? Or do you,
I've got a class in 10 minutes, but
I can talk to you for a minute.